You sit in a chair designed for waiting. Metal frame, thin padding, the kind of furniture that governments buy in bulk because comfort is expensive and military budgets prioritize other things. The air in the bunker is recycled, filtered through systems that remove dust and pollen and the organic smell of outside, replacing it with a metallic sterility that tastes like breathing inside a machine. September 26, 1983. The Cold War has been cold for 38 years, a temperature maintained through the constant threat of becoming hot, through the delicate mathematics of mutually assured destruction, through the understanding that both sides possess enough nuclear weapons to end human civilization, and most of both sides believe the other side is crazy enough to use them. You are not sitting in this bunker, not yet, but you will be. First, you need to understand what it means to be the person standing between the world as it is and the world as it could be after 15 minutes of buttons being pressed and missiles being launched and cities becoming memories preserved only in the shadows burned into concrete. The responsibility feels physical, a weight that settles across your shoulders like a coat made of lead, growing heavier with each shift until you're not sure anymore where the uniform ends and your body begins. You are Stanislav Petrov, though right now, in this moment suspended between ordinary night and potential apocalypse, you are also every person who ever held someone else's life in their hands and felt the terrible vertigo of understanding that decisions have consequences that echo beyond the deciding. 44 years old, Lieutenant Colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, trained for this exact scenario, but trained also to never actually expect it, because systems are built on the assumption that they'll never be tested, and testing them means everyone loses. The bunker sits outside Moscow, specific location classified, though classification seems absurd for a facility designed to survive nuclear strikes, because survival implies there will be someone left who cares about secrets. Serpukhov 15, a name that sounds like a code because it is a code, because the Soviet military refers to sensitive installations the way doctors refer to tumors, with clinical detachment that pretends distance creates safety. 120 feet underground, deep enough that the weight of earth above becomes its own kind of pressure. A reminder that you're enclosed in a tomb that's only temporary until someone decides to make it permanent. The screens glow green in the dim light, early computer monitors that flicker occasionally with the fragile uncertainty of 1980s technology, displaying data gathered from satellites orbiting in the space between nations, in the no man's land above atmosphere, where machines watch other machines and report what they see to humans who must decide what the watching means. OKO, the Soviet early warning system, a network of satellites and ground stations that exist solely to answer one question: are the Americans launching? Because that's what it comes down to, not ideology or political theory or the grand narratives that historians will write, but a simple binary. Are missiles in the air? Yes or no? Launch or don't launch? Destroy the world or let it continue existing? The protocols are clear. If the satellites detect launches, you report it immediately to command. Command notifies the General Secretary authorizes retaliation, and approximately 30 minutes after the first American missiles leave their silos, Soviet missiles leave theirs, and then everyone dies in overlapping waves of nuclear fire that turn cities into glass and atmosphere into poison. You've trained for this scenario hundreds of times, drills that simulate the unthinkable until it becomes routine,
until the end of the world is just another exercise with paperwork to fill out afterward. But training happens in daylight, with the knowledge that it's pretend, that the missiles aren't real, that you'll go home afterward to your apartment and your family and the ordinary problems of Soviet life that seem manageable compared to nuclear annihilation. Tonight is different. Tonight you're on duty, midnight shift, the hours when circadian rhythms are lowest and mistakes are most likely, the time when human judgment is least reliable and most necessary. The bunker crew is small, 15 people responsible for monitoring systems that monitor the world, 15 people who stand between sensor data and global catastrophe. You know them, have worked alongside them for months, know who takes their tea with sugar and who smokes too much and who has children the same age as yours. The routine is numbing and essential. Check the displays, monitor the satellites, watch for anomalies that might indicate malfunction or might indicate the end of everything. Most nights nothing happens. The screens show empty skies, the satellites report absence rather than presence, and the shift passes in the peculiar tedium of waiting for something that must never arrive. You drink coffee that tastes like it was brewed sometime last week, thick and bitter, providing caffeine and nothing resembling pleasure. And then the alarm sounds.
The noise is shrill and immediate, designed to cut through exhaustion and routine and the comfortable assumption that tonight will be like every other night. Your heart accelerates before your mind catches up, animal response to threat that bypasses thought entirely, adrenaline flooding your system in preparation for action, even though action in this context means ending the world. The screen flashes red, a color chosen specifically because red means danger in every human culture, because red bypasses cultural conditioning and speaks directly to the part of the brain that remembers when threats were simple and survival meant running from predators instead of deciding whether to incinerate millions. The computer reports 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from the United States, trajectory calculated, impact sites predicted, time to Moscow estimated at 23 minutes. 23 minutes. Less time than it takes to watch a television program, less time than a lunch break, barely enough time to call your family and say goodbye, except saying goodbye would violate protocol. And protocol exists because someone decided that if the world is ending, it should end according to regulations. The other officers are looking at you, waiting for the decision that protocol demands, the immediate report to command that starts the machinery of retaliation moving. Their faces show the particular expression that people wear when reality has suddenly become something they trained for but never believed would actually happen. A mixture of fear and disbelief, and the desperate hope that this is another drill, that someone will announce it's a test, and everyone can return to the comfortable routine of watching empty skies. But no announcement comes. The alarm continues its mechanical shrieking. The screen continues showing missiles, 5 red arcs climbing toward the apex of their trajectory, each one carrying multiple warheads, each warhead carrying enough destructive force to erase a city, erase the people in that city, erase the memories of those people, except as statistics in the historical record of how humanity chose extinction. You should pick up the phone. The protocol is explicit. Satellite detection of launch requires immediate notification to military command. Command escalates to political leadership. Political leadership authorizes response.
The chain is designed to be automatic, to remove human hesitation from a process where hesitation could mean losing the ability to retaliate, where delay could mean dying without taking the enemy with you. Mutual assured destruction only works if both sides believe the other will actually launch, if deterrence is credible, if the threat is real. But something stops you. Not courage. Courage implies choice made in the face of fear. And this isn't fear exactly, but something closer to confusion, the intellectual vertigo of data that doesn't quite make sense. 5 missiles. Only 5. The Americans have thousands, enough to target every significant military installation, every city above a certain population threshold, enough to ensure that Soviet retaliation capability is destroyed before it can be used. 5 missiles aren't enough. They're either a mistake or they're the opening move of a first strike. And if they're the opening move, then hundreds more should be showing on the screens right now. Not in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, but now, all at once, the full weight of American nuclear arsenal committed to the gamble that they can destroy Soviet ability to respond before response becomes possible. The screen shows only 5. 5 missiles crossing the Arctic, 5 threads of doom in a sky that should be full of them if this is real. You look at the data again, not because looking will change it, but because your mind is searching for something to explain the discrepancy between what training says should happen and what the satellite is reporting. The satellite, Cosmos 1382, one of the Oco constellation, orbiting at an altitude where space is still technically space, but thin atmosphere creates drag that limits operational lifespan to a few years before replacement becomes necessary. The sensor is infrared, designed to detect the heat bloom of rocket motors against the cold background of space, to distinguish between the brief flare of missiles launching and the ambient thermal noise of a planet that generates heat through weather and industry and the ordinary friction of existence. But infrared sensors have failure modes. They see things that aren't there, reflections from clouds at certain angles, sunlight bouncing from high-altitude ice crystals, the thermal signature of industrial facilities that happen to align with the sensor's field of view at the wrong moment. False alarms happen, not often enough to make the system useless, but often enough that every officer who monitors these screens has seen the computer report launches that turned out to be sensor artifacts, ghosts in the machine, the technological equivalent of shadows that look like threats until you examine them closely. You have minutes to decide, not many, because delay compounds with each second that passes, because command needs time to brief leadership, and leadership needs time to authorize retaliation. And if this is real, then every minute you waste is a minute closer to Soviet missiles being destroyed in their silos before they can launch. The weight of responsibility is crushing, not metaphorically, but physically, your chest tight with the pressure of breathing air that feels suddenly insufficient.
Your hand hovers near the phone, the red telephone that connects directly to command, that exists for exactly this purpose, this moment that was always theoretical until suddenly it isn't. The protocol is screaming at you, not just the alarm, but the voice in your head that sounds like every training session, every briefing, every officer who ever explained that hesitation in nuclear war means national suicide, that doubt is luxury reserved for peacetime, that your job is to report and let others decide, because the chain of command exists precisely to distribute the unbearable weight of these decisions across multiple shoulders. But you don't pick up the phone. Not yet.
Because something deeper than training is asserting itself. The instinct that comes from years of watching these systems, from understanding their quirks and failures, from knowing the difference between data and reality. You ask for verification, demand that the ground-based radar systems confirm what the satellite is reporting, that other sensors corroborate this story about 5 American missiles ending the world. The answer comes back wrong. The ground radars see nothing, empty sky, no missiles, no signatures that would indicate anything crossing the Arctic except commercial flights and weather patterns and the ordinary traffic of a planet where most things happening are not the end of everything. The satellite insists. 5 missiles, still climbing, still on trajectory, still approximately 18 minutes from impact. But the radars are silent, and radars don't lie the way satellites can. Radars see physical objects rather than thermal signatures. Radars are harder to fool. The discrepancy should resolve the question. Satellite says yes, radar says no. Trust the radar, ignore the satellite, return to the routine of waiting for catastrophe that never arrives. But the doubt works both ways. What if the radars are wrong? What if they're malfunctioning or jammed or simply unable to detect missiles at this range? What if the satellite is right and you're dismissing the end of the world because you want to believe it isn't happening? The other officers are watching, their silence heavy with expectation, with the understanding that they're witnesses to a decision they're grateful they don't have to make. One of them, Lieutenant Baranov, 26 years old, married 3 months ago, says quietly that you should call it in, that protocol exists for reasons, that it isn't your job to decide if the attack is real, but only to report what the systems are saying. He's right. Procedurally, technically, according to every regulation that governs this situation, he's absolutely right. Your responsibility is narrow. Observe the data, report the data, let the chain of command function as designed. You are not authorized to evaluate the credibility of an attack. You're authorized to report sensor data and trust that people with more information and higher clearance will make the appropriate decision. But the appropriate decision is nuclear retaliation. The appropriate decision is launching Soviet missiles toward American cities, toward New York and Washington and Los Angeles, toward places you've never seen but can imagine, places full of people who are currently asleep or eating dinner or watching television or doing the 1,000 ordinary things that people do when they don't know they have 18 minutes left of existence. The appropriate decision is ending those lives, not because those people have done anything to you personally, but because they happen to live in the country whose satellites have possibly malfunctioned in a way that creates the appearance of attack. You look at the clock. 15 minutes have passed since the alarm. 15 minutes of delay that has probably already triggered alerts somewhere up the chain. Questions about why Serpukhov 15 hasn't reported. Concerns about whether the bunker itself has been compromised. The phone will ring soon. Command calling to ask why you haven't called them. Demanding explanation for silence that protocol doesn't permit. The satellite continues reporting. 5 missiles, now 12 minutes from impact. Still no confirmation from ground radar. Still no additional launches that would indicate a full-scale attack. Your mind performs calculations that feel obscene, trying to estimate the probability of sensor malfunction versus the probability of limited American first strike, trying to weigh the cost of being wrong in either direction. If you don't report and it's real, Moscow burns, millions die, Soviet leadership is decapitated before they can authorize retaliation, and history remembers you as the officer who hesitated when hesitation meant national extinction.
If you do report, and it's false, the machinery of retaliation begins moving, possibly beyond the point where it can be stopped, possibly resulting in launches based on sensor data that was wrong, possibly initiating the nuclear exchange that both sides have spent 38 years trying to avoid. The Americans will see Soviet missiles launching. Their satellites work as well as yours. Their early warning is probably better. They'll retaliate, not 5 missiles, but hundreds, thousands, the full weight of their arsenal committed, because if you're launching, then they're already dead, unless they launch too. And then everyone dies. Not immediately. Nuclear war doesn't work that way, doesn't grant the mercy of instant extinction. First, the bombs, cities vaporized in microseconds, the fortunate ones who die before their nerve endings can report pain to brains that are already ash. Then the firestorms, consuming everything combustible in radiating waves that create their own weather systems, winds strong enough to uproot trees, temperatures high enough to melt glass. Then the fallout, radioactive particles lifted into atmosphere and distributed by winds that don't care about borders or politics or which side started it, settling back to Earth in patterns that turn farmland toxic and water deadly.
The survivors would envy the dead. This phrase that always seemed melodramatic in training suddenly reveals itself as simple accuracy. Clinical description of what happens when radiation sickness spreads through populations without medical infrastructure because the medical infrastructure burned with everything else. You imagine it despite yourself. Children dying slowly from doses that destroy their bone marrow, their bodies unable to produce the blood cells necessary for life. Physicians watching helplessly because there's no treatment when thousands need care simultaneously and the facilities that could provide care are craters. The nuclear winter that follows, not immediate but inevitable. Smoke and ash lifted into the stratosphere where it blocks sunlight for months or years. Global temperatures dropping until agriculture becomes impossible. Starvation spreading across continents that weren't even involved in the war but get to die anyway because fallout and climate don't respect neutrality. The end of civilization, not instantly but incrementally, through the cascade of failures that follows when the systems that sustain 7 billion people collapse simultaneously. All of this from picking up a phone. All of this from following protocol, from trusting the satellite, from doing exactly what you were trained to do, from being a good soldier who obeys orders and reports data and lets others make the difficult decisions, except there is no other. There is only you in this moment, in this bunker, with this choice. 10 minutes have passed since you should have made the call. The silence from command is ominous. They know something is wrong. They're probably trying to reach you through other channels. They're preparing for the possibility that Serpukhov 15 has been compromised or destroyed, or that you've suffered some kind of breakdown that's preventing you from performing your duty. The duty, such a clean word for ending the world, such a simple concept for impossible complexity. You make a decision, not through rational analysis, but through something deeper, the accumulated intuition of years watching these systems, understanding their failures, recognizing the pattern of sensor errors versus actual threats. The satellite is wrong. You decide this not with certainty, but with sufficient confidence to bet the world on it, to stake everything on the judgment that 5 missiles don't make sense, that the Americans wouldn't launch a limited strike when their doctrine requires overwhelming first strike to be effective,
that this is a malfunction and not an attack. You don't pick up the phone. Instead, you report it as a false alarm, a system error, sensor malfunction, nothing to escalate. Your voice is steady, years of military discipline providing the appearance of confidence, even while your mind screams that you could be wrong, that you're gambling millions of lives on intuition and incomplete data, and the desperate hope that you understand these systems better than they understand themselves. The other officers look uncertain, relieved that someone made the decision, but anxious about the consequences if the decision is wrong. If mushroom clouds bloom over Moscow in the next 8 minutes, if your family and their families and everyone they've ever known becomes vapor and shadow, it will be your fault, your choice, your name attached to the failure that allowed the Soviet Union to be destroyed without retaliation. The minutes crawl, 7 minutes until the missiles would impact, if they exist, if they're real, if the satellite is reporting truth instead of phantom images created by sensor error and unfortunate alignment of sunlight and clouds. You watch the screens, half expecting to see the characteristic signatures of warheads re-entering atmosphere, the plasma trails that would confirm the attack and confirm your error. 6 minutes. 5. Your breathing is shallow, each inhalation requiring conscious effort, your body apparently uncertain whether continuing to breathe is worth the investment if extinction is arriving in 4 minutes. The phone rings, command demanding explanation, asking why you haven't reported what the satellite is clearly showing, their voices carrying the edge of panic that comes from receiving conflicting information during a potential crisis. You explain, sensor malfunction, ground radar shows nothing, assessment is false alarm. They ask if you're certain, and you lie, say yes, say you're certain because uncertainty at this point helps no one. 3 minutes. 2. The crew is silent, everyone watching screens that continue insisting missiles are incoming, everyone waiting for the moment when either you're proven right or everyone stops caring because they're dead. 1 minute. 0. Impact time. Except there is no impact, no detonations lighting up the board, no seismic sensors reporting the characteristic double flash of nuclear explosions. The screens show normal. Moscow continues existing. The bunker continues humming with recycled air. The world continues its rotation without interruption. You were right. The satellite was wrong. Later investigation will reveal it was sunlight reflecting from high-altitude clouds at precisely the angle needed to create infrared signatures that mimicked rocket launches. A coincidence so improbable that it seems designed to test whether the systems built to prevent nuclear war would actually prevent nuclear war or would simply automate it. The false alarm is logged, paperwork filed, incident reviewed, procedures examined for weaknesses that allowed one man's judgment to override explicit sensor data. But you are not celebrated. Soviet system doesn't reward officers who ignore protocols, even when ignoring them prevents World War III, even when following them would have potentially triggered the extinction event that 38 years of Cold War had been carefully calibrated to avoid.
The investigation comes quietly, not with accusations exactly, but with questions that feel like accusations, with the particular tone that military bureaucracies use when they're uncertain whether you're a hero or a problem that needs solving. Why didn't you follow protocol? What gave you authority to override explicit satellite data? How can the chain of command function if individual officers substitute personal judgment for established procedures? The questions are valid, terrifyingly valid, because they expose the paradox at the heart of nuclear deterrence, the impossibility of building systems that are simultaneously automatic enough to be credible threats and human enough to prevent accidents from becoming apocalypses. You have no good answers. You followed instinct, trusted experience over data, believed that 5 missiles made no strategic sense when thousands would be required for effective first strike. You were right, but being right feels almost incidental to the larger question of whether rightness obtained through protocol violation is acceptable in systems designed to prevent the end of civilization. If you had been wrong, if the missiles were real, and your hesitation allowed Moscow to burn without retaliation, the investigation would be very different. The questions would be simpler, and your name would carry a particular infamy reserved for those whose failures are measured in millions of deaths. They reassign you, not as punishment exactly, but as the practical consequence of being an officer who has demonstrated willingness to deviate from protocol during the exact scenario where protocol deviation could mean national extinction. You spend the rest of your career in positions of decreasing responsibility, writing software, training younger officers on systems you no longer operate, gradually fading from relevance until retirement comes as relief rather than loss. The Soviet Union doesn't acknowledge what happened, not publicly, because acknowledging it would mean admitting how close the world came to ending because of sensor malfunction and protocol rigidity, would mean revealing the fragility of systems that are supposed to appear invincible. The incident is classified, buried in archives that won't be opened for decades, known only to the few dozen people who were in the bunker or the command chain or the investigation that followed. You live quietly, return to ordinary existence, to the small concerns of civilian life that seem simultaneously trivial and precious. Your family never knows, not because you choose secrecy, but because explaining would require language that doesn't exist for describing the feeling of holding extinction in your hands and choosing to set it down gently. How do you tell your children that you saved them without them knowing they needed saving? How do you explain that their existence, their futures, their possibility of growing old and having children of their own, all depended on one moment when their father looked at data and decided the data was lying? The years pass, Soviet Union collapses, Cold War ends, not with the nuclear exchange that both sides prepared for, but with economic exhaustion and political transformation, with systems built for eternal conflict discovering that nothing is eternal. The bunker at Serpukhov 15 is decommissioned, equipment removed, tunnels sealed, the underground fortress where you made the most important decision of your life becoming just empty concrete waiting to be forgotten. The story eventually emerges, leaked through the cracks that appear when empires fall apart and classification becomes less important than history. Journalists find you, ask for interviews, want to hear about the night you saved the world, frame you as a hero in narratives that make complex reality simple enough for headlines. You cooperate reluctantly, not because you want attention, but because you recognize that people need to understand how fragile everything is, how close extinction came because of sensors and sunlight and protocols that didn't account for the possibility that sensors could be wrong in ways that looked exactly like them being catastrophically right. The awards come late, 30 years after the incident, recognition from organizations that give prizes for preventing disasters that didn't happen. You accept them with the bemused detachment of someone who understands that heroism is often just the word we apply to people who were in impossible situations and chose slightly less badly than they might have. The World Citizen Award,
the Dresden Peace Prize, tokens that acknowledge debt that can never actually be repaid because the price of being wrong was extinction, and you can't compensate someone for not ending everything. You die in 2017, 77 years old, having lived long enough to see the Cold War become history that young people study in school without quite believing it was real, without understanding the particular texture of fear that came from knowing your city could be vaporized with 15 minutes warning. The obituaries call you the man who saved the world, a phrase that makes you sound more decisive than you felt, more certain than you were, more heroic than the reality of standing in a bunker and hoping your sensor failure was correct. But perhaps that's what heroism actually is, not certainty in the face of danger, but action despite uncertainty, not fearlessness, but fear overcome through necessity, not confidence, but the decision to trust judgment, even when judgment could be catastrophically wrong. You weren't brave, you were just a man who understood systems well enough to recognize when they were failing, who valued human judgment over mechanical certainty, who chose to believe that the world made enough sense that 5 missiles meant sensor error rather than strategic attack. The world you saved continues. 7 billion people who mostly don't know your name, who live and die and worry about mortgages and health and relationships, who exist because you didn't pick up a phone on September 26, 1983. Their children, born because their parents weren't vaporized in nuclear fire. Their grandchildren, possible because you looked at data and decided the data was wrong. The cascade of existence that flows from that moment is incalculable. Every person born after 1983 who wouldn't exist if you'd followed protocol. Every invention and artwork and act of kindness that happened because the world continued instead of ending. You never calculated this, never thought in terms of lives saved or futures preserved, because thinking that way would make the weight unbearable. You just did your job, or failed to do it, depending on how you define job, depending on whether protocol is more important than judgment, depending on whether systems serve humans or humans serve systems. The truth is simpler and more complex. You were a person in an impossible situation who made a choice based on incomplete information and got lucky that the choice was correct. But lucky doesn't diminish the choice, doesn't make it less courageous to trust yourself when trusting yourself meant potentially allowing your country to be destroyed without retaliation. The world needed someone like you in that bunker on that night, someone experienced enough to recognize sensor failure, brave enough to ignore protocol, human enough to value judgment over automation.